Hello, everyone, and welcome to this week's lecture on the Chicano movement. We will basically be going over some of the key leaders and players in the Chicano movement, the different organizations that were created, and so on. And so I, of course, won't be highlighting everything that there is to know about this movement. You could almost do a course just on the movement itself, but this at least sort of highlights some of the major individuals that were involved in the movement. So, of course, we start with Cesar Chavez and Dolores Huerta, who were known for their involvement in the farm worker movement, for leading that movement for many years, and affecting the working conditions of farm workers, particularly in California. And so we can understand why they became involved in this movement by seeing some of their previous history. So Cesar Chavez family lost their farm during the Great Depression and became migrant workers. He serves in the U.S. Navy during World War II and began his career organizing with the CSO. Dolores Huerta was born in New Mexico. Her father was a coal miner and labor activist, and her mother had worked as a cannery worker in Stockton, California. And she left her career in teaching to work with the CSO. So it was through the CSO that they met each other, and the kind of seed of what would eventually become the United Farm Workers was planted. So you could see from their own backgrounds why they would be interested in this particular movement. Now, one of the articles focuses specifically on Dolores Huerta, and so here we see some of, again, her background, but also the significant role that she played within the organization that often isn't talked about or is kind of downplayed. And then, of course, Cesar Chavez is the one that, everyone talks about as being part of this movement. So she was born in 1930 and grew up among farm workers in California. She co-founded with Cesar Chavez the National Farm Workers Association, which later became the United Farm Workers, and successfully organized farm workers throughout California. She served as a key contract negotiator and lobbyist and was known as the quote-unquote dragon lady for her negotiation tactics. She, as I mentioned, was a talented lobbyist for the UFW. She would be the one that would go to the state legislature to DC to lobby politicians to gain their support for the movement, to change laws in California that would benefit farm workers. And she, again, as I mentioned before, was the one who was in the room negotiating the actual contracts. And so often she was the only woman, the only Latina in that room negotiating with the corporate owners of these huge farms. And so you can imagine what that might have been like for her, particularly during a time period where it was not acceptable for women to take on that kind of activist, aggressive kind of role, and especially was not expected coming from a Mexican-American woman. There's been new literature coming out in the last few years about the relationship between Dolores Huerta and Cesar Chavez and how there were moments of tension between them. She had 11 children, and she would leave these children behind to do her work out in the fields, going from farm to farm, talking to farm workers, talking to politicians, and so on. And she was doing this basically for no pay. And so she was often arguing with Cesar to provide more funds for her to be able to do the work that she needed to do, but also to be able to support her family. She becomes the founder and president of the Dolores Huerta Foundation, where she travels across the country engaging in campaigns and influencing legislation that supports equality and defense of civil rights. She often speaks to students and organizations about issues of social justice and public policy. And in 2012, she was awarded the Presidential Medal of Freedom by President Obama. The farm worker, the United Farm Workers became known for its nonviolent tactics and its reliance on university students and allies and volunteers from religious organizations, and their use of mass mobilizing techniques like the March to Sacramento. Also connected to the movement were cultural symbols, as you see in this image, such as the Mexican flag and images of the Virgen de Guadalupe, the patron saint of Mexico. They were most famous for the national grape boycott, which culminated in the Delano growers recognizing the union and signing contracts that improved the working conditions of farm workers. The march from Delano to Sacramento in 1966 took place to actually gain support for the grape boycott. In 1975, because of the lobbying efforts of the union, the California legislature passed the California Farm Labor Act, which established a review board to monitor unfair labor. Unfortunately, by the 1980s, those that came into power in the state of California quickly undermined these laws, requiring once again for Chavez to call for a grape boycott. Cesar Chavez died in 1993. Then, as mentioned previously, a part of the movement were, there was also sort of a cultural revolution, a cultural movement and component to the different events that took place during this time period. One of these cultural organizations was El Teatro Campesino, founded by playwright and actor Luis Valdez. They worked very closely with the UFW, creating skits depicting the injustices experienced by farm workers. These skits were used as for educational purposes and to recruit workers into the union, and also as a fundraising tool. They would perform on flatbed trucks and union halls, where basically the actors would play the farm workers, and other actors would play their supervisors, and sort of would play out, right, would act out the roles and conditions that these people were experiencing, as a way to raise awareness, but also to create an environment where the workers could have a conversation about what they were actually experiencing. Now, often when we talk about the farm worker movement, we sort of tend to just focus on the United Farm Workers and the movement in California, but there were farm worker movements throughout the United States. In South Texas, farm workers were supported by more conservative organizations like the GI Forum and LULAC. They organized what they called the Minimum Wage March from the Rio Grande Valley to Austin. Their efforts resulted in the first minimum wage law in Texas. In the Midwest, Valdemar Vasquez created the Farm Labor Organizing Committee in 1967 to address the injustices experienced by farm workers in the Midwest. Currently, these organizations are still very active and conducting campaigns on behalf of tobacco workers in the South. And their work of these leaders in these organizations has been recognized throughout the country. A very different kind of organization and leader was La Alianza, which focused its efforts in the state of New Mexico. And the leader of this movement was Reyes Lopez Tijerina, who was originally a fundamentalist preacher from Texas and he ends up joining the struggle for land rights in New Mexico after becoming a lawyer. He inspires and galvanizes the local communities, which up to this point have been frustrated with their experiences of poverty and loss of land, but were leaderless. The Alianza was founded in 1966 to dispute the ownership of land grants by the United States in New Mexico. He was relying on the rights stipulated in the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo to argue that the land grants were taken illegally and should be returned to the descendants of their rightful owners. Their first action was taking over the Kit Carson National Forest, claiming it had been part of the Tierra Amarilla land grant and had been illegally stolen by the government. They also took over or raided the Tierra Amarilla courthouse, which became an infamous event for which he is often remembered, where he, along with other members of the group, stormed the courthouse in Tierra Amarilla when other members who had been previously arrested would be appearing for a hearing. They claimed they were making a citizen's arrest of the district attorney, Alfonso Sanchez. The significance of this movement was that it brought attention to the issue of land, poverty, and fit within the larger struggles of Mexican Americans who have been feeling angry and frustrated at their second-class citizenship and lack of rights. Because of these two actions, however, a lot of time and resources of the organization were spent in legal battles. While he was acquitted on the shootout that took place at Tierra Amarilla, he was sentenced to prison in federal courts for his involvement in the Kit Carson forest takeover. Now, this one may be a little bit more familiar for those of you that are from Denver. The founder of the Crusade for Justice in Denver, Colorado was Jorge Gonzalez. He attracted more urban Chicano youth and addressed their sense of injustice and perpetual discrimination. So his movement was more of an urban movement and addressed the kinds of discrimination that many urban youth in particular were experiencing, like police brutality, segregation in schools, and so on. He's an interesting figure because he represents someone who attempted to make change by working within the political system before breaking out and creating the Crusade for Justice. He worked with registering voters. He worked with the Democratic Party. He also worked with a number of anti-poverty programs created by the Johnson administration's War on Poverty. However, he eventually becomes disillusioned with the lack of commitment by mainstream politicians. One of the major events that the organization is known for is for the youth conference that takes place in 1969 in Denver, where Chicanos from all over the country came to create a plan of action. It was the creation of what became known as the Chicano nationalist movement that addressed affirmation of culture, creating their own institutions, community control of schools, and eventually one of the goals was to create their own political party. And this was all, this plan was all put together and became known as El Plan Espiritual de Aztlán. Now, one of the key parts of the experience of this conference was cultural affirmation. The video that I have available for you to watch covers what happens in this conference and talks about, and has many people who participated talk about their experience. And a lot of what they share is how empowering it was to be in a space with so many Chicanos from all over the country, for parts of the country that they didn't even know there were Chicanos. And so how like culturally affirming, but also politically empowering that experience was for them. But there were also some gender-related tensions. The conference included a number of different workshops and breakout sessions. And one of those was a Chicana caucus, where even though they discussed a lot of different, gender issues, feminist issues that were relevant to the experiences of Chicanas in particular. When it came time to sort of report out to the larger conference what the caucus had concluded in its discussions, the statement that came out was that Chicana does not want to be liberated. Now, this could be interpreted in a number of different ways, right? Because one of the things that many Chicanas talk about who experienced the movement was how they were conflicted between supporting the bigger Chicano movement, the nationalist movement, versus addressing women's issues and gender issues. And the women's movement, of course, is going on at the same time, the mainstream women's movement. And it was perceived as this white women only kind of movement, and so was often criticized. So if Chicanas said that they wanted to be liberated, which at the time, using the term liberated meant was perceived as saying you were part of the women's liberation movement, they would get criticized from within their own organizations and communities for supposedly selling out, right? So to say that they did not want to be liberated could have been a way for them to send the message that they weren't selling out to the women's liberation movement and that they were focused on the issues and the agenda of the Chicano nationalist movement. In the 1970s, the organization becomes a supporter and an ally of the American Indian movement, and the organization is targeted for FBI infiltration, and was listed as a quote unquote subversive organization, and the targeted for FBI infiltration, which meant FBI agents would infiltrate and pretend that they were part of the organization in order to destabilize the organization. And this was a strategy that was used for many of the organizations of this time period. Now, the goal of creating their own political party was achieved in Texas through the creation of La Raza Unida Party. The founder of the party was Jose Angel Gutierrez. He began his career as an activist, as an organizer for the Political Association of Spanish-Speaking Organizations, or PASO, and he also founded the Mexican American Youth Organization in 1968 to organize students and community leaders to effect change in the school system in Texas. The party was particularly inspired after a school strike took place in Crystal City, Texas, where students protested the lack of Mexican-American students in popular extracurricular groups like the cheerleading squad. And so this galvanizes the Mexican-American community in Crystal City, and they create the party and actually run for the first time candidates to local elections. They have their most influence in the 1970s, where they were able to win some of these local governmental positions. But once the next election term came around, many of the folks that had been elected were elected out and replaced by Anglo politicians. They also experienced infiltration by the FBI and harassment, and were under surveillance. Between the years of 1970 and 1974, the party ran 176 candidates for state and local political positions. One of the major movements of this time was the student movement. Also something that some of you may have heard of or may be familiar with, because some of this happened here in Denver as well, where Denver students walked out of their schools in protest of how particular teachers were treating them, and were calling for not just the dismissal of those teachers, but also what many students throughout other parts of the Southwest were making demands of. So these were known as high school blowouts, is how they became known, where high school students organized major protests where they walked out of their schools, thousands of them, and sponsored marches demanding better quality education, better trained and Chicano teachers, and the institutionalization of Chicano ethnic studies into their school curriculum. So the movement to start Chicano studies, Latino studies, ethnic studies, this was where this all started. One of the main leaders of this movement, particularly in California, was Sal Castro, who was a teacher in one of the schools in the area, who was disillusioned with the educational system in Los Angeles and had tried to work with the school system because he was one of the very few Chicano teachers at that time, and was significantly disillusioned with the response that he received from principals and colleagues and so on. And so he essentially was very open with his students about their rights and what they deserved to have, and essentially helped them organize behind the scenes. In Texas, we see the movement taking place in Crystal City, where students and parents made demands for Mexican-American teachers in a bilingual education program. The Justice Department intervened and negotiated a settlement. Part of why these walkouts were successful was because funding for schools depended on student attendance. So if the students didn't attend school, then that affected the budgets of the school. So it was a very, smart way for students to sort of have leverage, right, some of their own power. Losing a month of state funds in Crystal City due to 65% absence rates made it easier for the school officials in Crystal City to cave in to some of the student demands. This movement also took place at the college level, where students organized and held their own walkouts and protests, making demands for what later became ethnic studies and Chicano studies departments. College students organized their own student organizations on different campuses as they organized their protests. Many of these different student organizations later on came under one umbrella group known as MECHA, Movimiento Estudiantil Chicano de Aztlán. And they had a conference in 1969 in Santa Barbara where they created their own plan that became known as El Plan de Santa Barbara, and where they delineated what their goals were as students. One of their primary goals being to create Chicano studies departments and institutions of higher education. And so many of the Chicano studies programs or Latinx studies programs, ethnic studies programs that you see that exist, especially throughout the Southwest, many of them were created during this time period. Another organization the reading talks about is the Brown Berets, founded by David Sanchez and Carlos Montes. This organization was influenced by other nationalist revolutionary movements like the Black Panthers and the Puerto Rican Young Lords. They operated community serving programs like free health clinics, free breakfast programs, and really focused on the plight of barrio residents in LA. So they were also another example of an urban movement. And they were also, because of how they presented themselves, as you see in the images, they were perceived by mainstream media, by the police, by the FBI as a militant types of organizations, and so were targeted by the LA police and the FBI. And what you see in these images is that a lot of these more organizations that had more of a militant type of structure often are perceived as having been male dominated, but what you see here in the top image is that women were also very much involved and present in this organization. One of the other people that one of the articles talked about is Alicia Escalante. She was born in Texas in 1933 and grew up living in poverty with her mother in California. And so this experience of living in poverty and being a welfare recipient herself and her mother leads her to form the East Los Angeles Chicana Welfare Rights Organization in 1967. The organization dedicated itself to advocating for the rights of welfare recipients, including English translation of welfare documents, childcare, and job training. One of the other activities that they were involved with was organizing single mothers with their children to attend the Poor People's Campaign in 1968 in Washington, D.C. The organization also attended the Denver Crusade for Justice conference, and there are images of the members of the organization and her in particular being present and involved. Now, one of the reasons she's one of these individuals that often is not part of the conversation when we talk about the Chicano movement. But one of the reasons why I like to include her is because on the one hand, she focuses on women, right? But she focuses on women who were on welfare. And the conversation of Latinas being on welfare is something that even within the Latinx communities is a source of shame. And so I think it's important to highlight that these women are not, as the media tends to represent them, as people who are just dependent, they're not contributing citizens to the society, but that women in these situations can be leaders, have been leaders, and are able to organize themselves to address their own needs as women, women in poverty, single mothers, and so on. Now, of course, one of the other things that's going on during this time period that many people are organizing around is the Vietnam War. And so you have a large anti-war movement that's also going on nationally. Now, this ends up impacting the Mexican-American community in particular because studies start to appear where it is shown that Mexican Americans were serving disproportionately in the war. So once again, we have this narrative of people, young men wanting to serve in the war as an opportunity to escape poverty, and also as a way to, again, reassert their Americanness, reassert their patriotism. 80,000 Mexican Americans saw combat. Throughout the war, Navy Lieutenant Everett Alvarez was the first pilot shot down and was a POW for 8 years. Among these individuals, 13 won the Medal of Honor for their actions in Vietnam. So on the one hand, there is this, pride of service during this war, but among the Mexican American community, as they became aware that there was more of them serving in the war than some of their Anglo and middle class counterparts, particularly in the Southwest, they became also involved in the anti-war movement. And this became especially addressed through what the event that became known as the Chicano Moratorium. So one of the other things, in addition to the disproportionate number of Mexican Americans serving and dying in the war, this movement was also inspired by the fact that funding was being cut from social programs to increase funding for the war. And so this was another reason for members of this community to join the anti-war movement. Now, this was supposed to be a peaceful march where 25 to 35,000 people participated, and the march would end at Laguna Park in Los Angeles. Now, this was families, mothers, children. This was supposed to be a community event, a family event, and a peaceful event. And so they arrive to the park, and police begin arriving, allegedly because there have been reports of disturbances, but instead ended up coming into the park fully geared up with riot gear, beating people with their billy clubs, shooting tear gas canisters into the crowd. And so all of a sudden, this went from a peaceful protest and march to chaos. One of the biggest losses of this event was the death of Ruben Salazar, who had been a journalist, a Chicano journalist, who was one of the few people who was actually covering the Chicano movement. He wrote for a mainstream newspaper, and so he was bringing visibility to the Chicano movement at this time. And while this is all happening at the park, he is at a nearby bar called the Silver Dollar Bar, where he was seated there having a drink after attending the moratorium. One of the police officers shoots into the dark bar a tear gas canister, and ends up hitting Ruben Salazar in the head and dies. So this was a shock to the system. This was a shock to the movement. They did not expect for there to be deaths during this event. And so it really sort of brought the moratorium committee and some of the movement momentum to a halt, because especially in Los Angeles, the community was in shock and in grief. One of the other elements of the Chicano movement that sometimes we don't talk about or don't we hear a lot about is the women's movement that was happening within the Chicano movement. So even though at the 1969 conferences, the Women's Caucus proclaimed that women do not want to be liberated, that does not mean that Chicana feminism doesn't exist, and that Chicanas aren't questioning how women are treated and the traditional roles and expectations of women. And so within the Chicano movement, within many of these organizations we've talked about, women were not only involved, but they were also pushing against the male leadership and challenging and raising questions about the expected role and traditional role of women. So they were often responding to many of the accepted images of Chicanas within the community of either being La Malinche or having to live up to the idea of La Virgen de Guadalupe. Now, the image of La Malinche, she had been an indigenous woman who had been given to Hernán Cortés and served as a translator. She had children with Hernán Cortés, and so her children are often considered the first mestizos and the first Mexicanos. But she's often portrayed as, perceived as a traitor for having slept with the enemy, having slept with the conqueror and helped him conquer the Aztecs. So the idea of being a sellout within the Chicano community at this time is gendered. Chicana feminists often were perceived or told that they were malinchistas for being traitors to the Chicano movement, for even bringing up any kind of women's issues. And so a response to that was to reimagine La Malinche, right? Reclaim the image of La Malinche for themselves. Another image that was often used or upheld to them to sort of live up to is the image of La Virgen de Guadalupe, which, as I mentioned before, is the patron saint of Mexico. But they were expected, sort of like the ideal Chicana was the woman who was a wife, a mother, a martyr. And so many of the women would also respond to this image and this like impossible, right, idealistic expectation that was put on them. They were often challenging machismo within these organizations and calling out the men for their sexist behavior. And as we saw, many Chicanas attended the Denver Youth Conference, where there were tensions among women, because as I mentioned, there was this division between and pressure, right, on some women to not affiliate themselves with women's liberation or with feminist movements, and that they needed to just focus on the Chicano movement. Whereas there were other women who were like, well, why can't we do both, right? Why some of the things that the women's liberation movement is bringing up is relevant to us. And then there's other gender issues, other women's issues, as Chicanas in particular, that we experience in our communities that should be addressed. Why shouldn't we do that, right? And this came to a head in 1971, where the National Chicana Conference was organized in Houston to create a feminist platform for the Chicano movement. But again, there were tensions within this event or during this event among women who were organizers, women who were supporting the idea of creating a feminist agenda, and other women who attended the conference and ended up, walking out of the conference in protest because they believed that that Chicanos should just be focusing on the Chicano nationalist movement and not be bringing up feminist or women's issues. One of the other important long-lasting impacts of this movement was the Cultural Revolution that came along with it, where the idea of Aslan came from this movement. So this idea that reclaiming the Southwest that had been conquered by the United States, the lands that had been lost by Mexican Americans who were already there, a way to sort of reclaim and reclaim that land for themselves, reclaim a sense of belonging to this region for themselves, was to call it Aslan. And it was part of this idea that the Aztecs, where they came from originally, had been from this part of Mexico. And so they reclaimed this term or created this term Aslan to identify that connection to their Aztec indigenous history. One of the other terms that appears during this time is the use of the term Chicano. Chicano was a derogatory term that was used by Mexican nationals to talk about Mexican Americans as being too Americanized, not real Mexicans anymore, and so on. During this time period, the youth of this movement reclaimed that term, Chicano, as a way to identify not just themselves as Mexican Americans, right, but also to recognize that they believed in a particular political ideology, right? That they believed in Chicano nationalism, that they believed in the activist movements that were happening in this time. So when you call yourself Chicano, even to this day, it means not just an ethnic identity, but it also signifies a political identity as well. There were, as you might expect, some divisions between within the nationalist movements, between those that call themselves cultural nationalists versus revolutionary nationalists. Cultural nationalists believed Chicanos constituted a distinct nation, distinct from Mexico, and their main goal was to unite Chicanos to achieve self-determination and political power within the US. Revolutionary nationalists saw Chicanos as Mexicans first and believed that they should join forces with working-class Mexican immigrants. They believed that Chicanos and Mexican immigrants constituted one pueblo sin fronteras, that they were all part of one nation, one community, one identity. And all of these different kinds of ideologies, cultural ideologies, were expressed and came out in different forms of art, in literature, in mural artwork. And so you had, for instance, the poem Yo Soy Joaquin by Jorge Gonzalez became sort of a clarion call to not only reclaim your Aztec history, reclaim your past, a cultural past and ethnic identity, but also as a way to unify Chicanos as being part of one nation, one Chicano community. And there was also this sort of rise of different kinds of artistic expression as muralist art, but also other forms of artwork that was happening at that time. So there's this cultural element also to this movement that came about as a result of all of these different events that were happening, all these different organizations, all these different ideologies that were swirling around in these moments that were about claiming your cultural identity, claiming your sense of belonging, that it was a moment of empowering, what it meant to be Chicano or Mexican American in this country. And so all of that is in the air and inspires artists to express that in forms of art. So that ends our lecture for this week. I look forward to your thoughts about the Chicano movement in our discussion post. Have a wonderful week.